Obviously, in the case of the Twin Towers, it would not have been possible to set off the preliminary explosions all at once, just before the collapse. To make them less noticeable, it would have been wise to set them off at separate intervals, any time between the impacts of the planes and the collapse of the towers. For this reason, it's important to keep in mind the exact chronology of the events. 8:46, first impact into the North Tower. 9:03, second impact into the South Tower. 9:59, collapse of the South Tower. 10:28, collapse of the North Tower. 5:20 in the afternoon, collapse of Building 7. Witnesses normally call first explosion the one that came with the impact of the planes, while they call secondary explosions all those that took place in separate moments between the impacts of the planes and the collapse of the two towers.
We got that first secondary explosion really got us spooked because we were in the building.
Then there was secondary explosions and then the subsequent collapses.
We've heard reports of secondary explosions after the aircraft impacted.
According to several witnesses, there was a secondary explosion that took place in the basement of the North Tower just before the plane hit the building.
At 8:30, he says he was headed to level B4 in Tower 1, 4 stories below ground.
I go downstairs, the foreman tells me to go to remove the containers. As I'm walking by the main freight car of the building, in the corridor, that's when I got blown. I mean, the impact of the explosion, of whatever happened, it threw me to the floor.
Morelli then remembers a second explosion, separate from the first.
I was racing, I was going towards the bathroom, all of a sudden, I opened the door, I didn't know it was a bathroom, and all of a sudden a big impact happened again. And all the ceiling tile was falling down, the light fixtures were falling.
According to the 9/11 Commission, it was the jet fuel pouring down the elevator shafts that caused the explosion in the basement. From the final report we read, a jet fuel fireball erupted upon impact and shot down at least one bank of elevators. The fireball exploded onto numerous lower floors, including the B4 level, 4 stories below the ground. But the witnesses described an explosion that took place in the basement before the impact of the plane.
Very strong. Boom! An explosion so hard that pushed us upwards. Upwards. And it came from the basement between the B2 level and the B3 level. And at that moment, I thought it was the mechanical room where they have all the pumps and the generators for the building, that maybe a generator just blew up on the basement. Now, 20 years in the building, you know something that comes from the bottom and something that comes from the top. And when I went to verbalize that it was a generator, we hear, boom, all the way on the top, the impact of the plane on the top. 2 different events, 2 different times.
There are others who remember several explosions after the one from below.
It came from, I believe, at first we believed that it came from the mechanical room. Then we heard a series of other explosions that sounded up on the above levels of the building.
I was in the B4 level, and on my way, I heard a bomb. So I says, probably the transformer again blew up. So I stepped back, finished what I had to finish, and I started towards the door again. And there come a big blast with a big ball of fire.
The 2 separate explosions were recorded at a distance of about 9 seconds from each other during a business meeting that was taking place in a building nearby, 1 Liberty Plaza.
It sounds like something crashed.
When faced with this precise question, the editors of Popular Mechanics chose not to answer it, and fell back on the generic explanation of the jet fuel in the elevator shafts.
Ask what your guys' explanation is for Willie Rodriguez's testimony that he heard, experienced, and his coworkers were actually burned by an explosion in the basement of the North Tower prior to the plane hitting, and this has been verified by at least 20 different eyewitnesses.
Jim Meggs of Popular Mechanics.
When the planes struck the buildings, they penetrated internal core. Jet fuel poured down stairwells and elevator shafts, setting off secondary explosions, not to mention the horrific impact of these fully loaded planes hitting the structure and causing an enormous swaying.
It's interesting to note, too, that
you still didn't address the fact that it was before.
Empire State Building crash back in 1945.
But the explanation of the jet fuel in the elevator shafts has several problems of its own. First of all, there were no regular elevators connecting the basement to the top levels of the towers. Each tower consisted of 3 separate buildings, built on top of one another, each with their own elevator system. There were only 2 elevators connecting the lobby to the 44th and 78th floor. But the plane struck on the 95th floor, which means the fuel could not have poured down these elevator shafts. There were only 2 banks of elevators that went all the way from the basement to the top of the towers, and they were mostly used by maintenance people. In one of these elevators was Arturo Griffith.
Well, I was on my way from B2 to 49th floor.
Not only didn't Griffith get cremated by this supposed ball of fire, but he also remembers 3 separate explosions.
And there was a loud explosion and the elevator dropped. When the elevator finally stopped, they had an explosion that bring the doors inside the elevator. And then they had another explosion on the panel that threw me, against the wall.
Most importantly, the theory of the jet fuel in the elevator shafts fails to take into consideration the volumes involved. Each tower had an approximate volume of 2,160,000 cubic yards. The planes that hit the towers carried an estimated 10,000 gallons of fuel each at the time of impact. 10,000 gallons is the equivalent of 50 cubic yards. This in-scale graphic shows what 50 cubic yards look like next to the volume of the tower. Assuming that about half of the fuel was consumed in the initial explosion, we would be left with some 25 cubic yards of fuel available. But most of this fuel is needed to ignite the fires at different floors, as explained by Mr. Meggs himself.
Jets crashed into buildings. They crashed at an angle, which meant that their wings, which is where they store most of their fuel, cut through multiple floors. So they splashed fuel and debris across multiple floors of the building, igniting fires.
So even assuming that, for some strange reason, 5 of those cubic yards were all to end up in the only elevator shaft that goes all the way to the bottom of the tower, there wouldn't be enough to reach the basement in significant quantities. Your typical 10-foot by 30-inch backyard pool contains roughly 1,000 gallons of water, which is the equivalent of 5 cubic yards. Imagine dumping the water from this pool into this kind of elevator shaft with a drop of more than 1,000 feet below, and you'll get the idea of how much fuel can actually reach the bottom. In any case, the fuel in the elevator shafts theory could never account for the powerful explosion that literally devastated the lobby of the North Tower 1 hour after the first impact and before the collapse of the South Tower.
It was a secondary explosion, probably a device either planted before or on the aircraft that did not explode until an hour later.
Then somebody said that they saw an airliner going to one of those towers. Then, I don't know, an hour later than that, we had that big explosion from much lower. I don't know what on earth caused that.
In fact, these firemen reported 3 large explosions in Tower 1, which took place after the plane's impact. They also confirmed it was the 3rd explosion to devastate the lobby of the tower.
It was an explosion. We was in the lobby and the 3rd explosion, the whole lobby collapsed on us.
What you told me is that there was a plane or whatever hit the building, then a secondary explosion.
It was like 3 explosions after that. We came in after the fire. We came when the fire was going on already. We was in the staging area inside the building, waiting to go upstairs. And they exploded. The whole lobby collapsed on the lobby inside.
It took these witnesses about 1 hour to walk down from the 82nd floor to the lobby of the North Tower after the impact of the plane.
We got to the 4th floor from 82nd floor.
We stuck on the stairs for a while. We finally got down to the lobby. Then we get to the lobby, it was this big explosion. I don't know if
everything went
just like what you just seen, that's what we went through before we came out of the building. Then when we get out the building, then another smoke cloud came.
A similar story here. The long descent from Tower 1 and the big explosion in the lobby.
It was like holy hell coming down them stairs. And then when we finally got to the bottom, we were coming out on the mezzanine level there, and another explosion came right from it, just everyone flying.
Yet another similar story.
Big boom, come down the steps, everything fine till we got to the basement, and everything just fell in. I got trapped in there with another guy, crawled out, kept getting hit in the head, bags rolled around, finally we clawed our way out over the rubble.
The situation in the lobby was such that there was no doubt on what had happened.
The ladies that are with me were in the World Trade Center in the first building and escaped through the lobby where they report they believe there was a bomb in the lobby.
We ran down the steps to the lobby. There was no lobby. Everything was torn up.
We came outside the lobby. There was no lobby. The lobby was totally gone.
Did you see other people?
There was a woman there with her face blown off.
Big glass lobby, and all the glass was broken. Wires hanging from the ceiling, the signs that would hang above telling you where to go were all hanging. It was unbelievably scary to look at.
Firefighter John Schroeder was climbing the stairs of Tower 1 when he heard the huge explosion from below.
We were heading up to the 24th floor of the stairwell, and all of a sudden our building got rocked. We got bounced around in the stairwell like pinballs, man. And we just said, you know what? Time to go. We came down, it looked like a bomb went off in the lobby. Everything was exploded, everything was gone. We're like, what is going on here? For every window in the lobby to be exploded, I mean, them windows were like as thick as forget it. They were 2-3 inch glasses, you know, come on. They exploded out of the lobby. You know, it wasn't from the jet fuel. No way.
Then we have the accounts from those who heard explosions moments before the South Tower collapsed. John McLaughlin was a police officer for the Port Authority.
Going into Tower 1, we heard a loud explosion coming from the area of Building 2, and at that point, Building 2 was collapsing.
We saw the top begin to blow out in a plume of smoke, and we heard the noise associated with an implosion.
I was about 5 blocks away when I heard explosions, 3 thuds, and turned around to see the building we just got out of. Antenna tip over and fall in on itself.
And then all of a sudden 3 tremendous explosions, and everything started coming down.
Then there was a tight sequence of detonations during the collapse of the South Tower, which many described as firecrackers.
You heard a big explosion before the building fell?
I saw it as it was happening, and it sounded as if you had 100 of those little black cat firecrackers and you lit them all off at once. That's what it sounded like. It sounded like the finale of the 4th of July.
As the first tower came down, there were a series of explosions. It was like boom, boom. You could hear the echoes of the explosions echoing off the different buildings.
The detonation started, and they went boom, boom, boom. They were a little less than a second apart.
Below the fire, I saw from the corner, boom, 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 boom. Just like 20 straight hits. Just
detonated.
Planned to take down a building. Boom, 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 boom.
All the way down.
So it was like boom, 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 boom.
From far away, boom, boom. And you heard the boom, 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 boom.
The same kind of detonations were heard during the collapse of the North Tower.
Second tower, number 1, the second tower collapsed. It was the exact same series of detonations.
And then it started to sound like firecrackers. Crack, 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 crack. And we looked up, and the second tower was coming down.
The debunkers doubt that there were explosions, they say, because no explosions were recorded in the videos from the collapses.
Le demolizioni fanno rumore, fanno dei botti estremamente precisi, fortissimi come li avete sentiti. Come mai nelle immagini delle torri gemelle non ci sono le esplosioni, ma c'è un solo boato continuo?
Lorsqu'il y a une explosion, on la ressent. On la ressent comme il faut. Ça se mesure, on l'enregistre. Aucune bande de son ne les enregistre. Aucune.
First of all, the debunkers forget that most of the television shots were taken from a distance with long telephoto lenses, and they don't carry the actual sound from the towers. While in the videos shot by amateurs, the soundtrack is usually covered by the screams of those standing around the camera. In any case, it's not true that no explosions were recorded by video cameras. In this shot, for example, a series of loud concussions can be heard just before the collapse begins. On the left, covered by smoke, is the South Tower moments before the collapse. In this shot by ABC television, the initial explosion can also be heard. Listen carefully after the words FBI agents.
This is as close as we can get to the base of the World Trade Center. You can see the firemen assembled here, the police officers, FBI agents. You can see the towers. A huge explosion now waiting to bring on all of us.
The explosion can be heard even better by separating the stereo track of the microphone from the one of the camera.
Here, the police officers, FBI agents. The police officers, FBI.
The same explosion can be heard in the same clip used in a PBS documentary.
But a key question remained. Did their ultimate failure
But a key question remained. Did their ultimate failure...
And then there were several explosions recorded after both towers had collapsed, like this one from this BBC video.
This one was recorded after both of the Twin Towers had collapsed and before Tower 7's collapse.
Amateurs also kept recording explosions after the collapse of both towers.
It's now 11 o'clock. Still hear continuing explosions, but... explosion.
This recording was made between 10 and 11 o'clock. The explosion came from the direction of Building 7. In fact, a big explosion in Building 7 was reported before either tower had collapsed. Sometime after 9 o'clock, Barry Jennings was descending the stairs of Building 7, trying to reach street level.
Well, me and Mr. Hesh, the Corporation Counsel, were on the 23rd floor. I told him we got to get out of here. We started walking down the stairs. We made it to the 8th floor. Big explosion. Blew us back into the 8th floor.
Jennings was trapped in the building for several hours, together with his colleague, Michael Hess.
Mr. Hess! 8th floor, 7 World Trade. I pass the word!
After they were rescued by the fire department, Mr. Hess confirmed the big explosion on the 8th floor.
So, Mr. Hess, you were trapped in, I believe, 7 World Trade Center. Go ahead, sir.
Yes, I was. I was up in the Emergency Management Center on the 23rd floor. Another gentleman and I walked down to the 8th floor where there was an explosion.
In a later interview, Jennings has confirmed the explosion took place before either tower had collapsed.
Both buildings were still standing. I was trapped in there for several hours. I was trapped in there when both buildings came down.
While he was trapped, Jennings kept hearing more explosions.
All this time, I'm hearing all types of explosions.
In fact, explosions near Building 7 were recorded up to a few minutes before the building collapsed. And finally, there is also someone who saw an explosion up close, through his very eyes. It's Ron DiFrancesco, the same person who had descended from the 91st floor of the South Tower all the way to the lobby.
When he was exiting the building, he heard an explosion. He spun around, and a fireball was coming down the hallway at him. He put his arms up, blew him across Church Street. He woke up in the hospital 2 days later.
Yeah, I had burns, they say, on 80% of my body, and a broken bone in my back, and I guess my ears were turned inside out just with the burns. My head was very swollen. You know, I had my contacts in, so they were melted to my eyes, and...
To doubt the content of all these accounts does not mean to have debunked the claims of explosions. It means to willfully ignore dozens and dozens of dramatic testimonies which describe a story of September 11 quite different from the one we have been told so far. Question. Given that after the initial explosion and the ensuing fires, there wouldn't have been enough jet fuel left to pour down the elevator shafts in substantial quantities, can you explain the at least 3 separate explosions reported by multiple witnesses at the time of the first impact in the North Tower? In particular, can you explain the huge explosion reported by multiple witnesses in the basement of the North Tower moments before the impact of the plane? Can you explain what caused the huge explosion that literally devastated the lobby of the North Tower, according to multiple witnesses, about 1 hour after the impact of the plane and before the collapse of Tower 2? Can you explain what caused the big explosion reported by Mr. Jennings and Mr. Hess on the 8th floor of Building 7 before either tower had collapsed? Can you explain what caused the multiple explosions recorded by different camera crews, including the BBC and CNN, after the towers had collapsed and before the collapse of Building 7? Can you explain how more than 100 witnesses, most of them firefighters and policemen, could have all been mistaken in reporting explosions at the Twin Towers on September 11? Another element suggesting controlled demolitions are the so-called squibs, the puffs of debris that were noticed on the sides of both towers as the collapses took place. Squibs occur in controlled demolitions when concrete is forcefully expelled from the building by the explosions occurring inside.
The individual explosions that I noticed 20 and 30 and 40 stories below the collapsing structure, those are what we demolitions guys call squibs. And that's another characteristic that seems to be evident.
But for the squibs in the Twin Towers, the debunkers have a different explanation.
A building like that, it's like a giant accordion. It's full of air. When the top of that building comes down, all that air has to come out. And where it comes out the windows. It blows out the windows.
Quanto agli sbuffi, se pensiamo a questi piani che si schiacciano uno sull'altro, l'aria che esce, che porta polvere, fumo e detriti fuori, li spiega abbastanza bene.
The debunkers forget that several squibs were observed 20, 30, or 40 floors below the level of the collapse, in an area where the floors above were still perfectly intact. There is no smoke or concrete to be pushed out here when the collapse has only reached this level at this point. But even in this case, the debunkers have an explanation.
Et ça s'explique justement par la communication des surpressions, par les cages d'ascenseur. Alors là, c'est les cages d'ascenseur, mais il y a bien sûr aussi des escaliers. Donc ça aussi, et ça a permis donc cette évacuation de l'air, non seulement sur les côtés, mais aussi dans toute la tour, en mettant en pression le bâtiment.
But elevators and stairs have doors at almost every floor. Had there been such a strong compression from above, it would have pushed with equal force on all the floors below, not just the one where the squib occurred. In any case, this is clearly not broken glass. Glass fragments from a window would not even be visible from such a distance. These are high-speed ejections of concrete and other solid debris, which can only be explained by a powerful explosion having occurred nearby. There is even one case in which the expulsion of material, and possibly a human being, takes place before the collapse has begun.
You see that blowout? That.
Question. Given that what we see is clearly not glass from a broken window, but concrete and other debris, can you explain what caused the squibs observed 30 or 40 floors below the level of collapse? Technically speaking, squibs are just a particular case of explosions occurring below the level of collapse. But powerful ejections of concrete and other material have been observed throughout the entire collapse of both towers. The result of such explosive force is the lateral ejection of large chunks of the external structure all around the towers.
The spread of debris in a large radius around each tower, what we see is an outward explosion of material beyond the perimeters of each footprint.
FEMA has documented a 1,200-foot diameter debris area around each tower where major chunks of the buildings were found. This means that parts of the structure were ejected laterally at a distance twice as large as the width of the tower itself.
Large multi-ton beams were hurled hundreds of yards laterally. Gravity works vertically, not laterally.
The debunkers contend that the material ejected laterally was only the aluminum foil covering the structure, not the steel beams themselves.
Ces éléments qui sont là, certains disent, vous vous rendez compte des poutres qui font plusieurs tonnes? Non, ça c'est pas des poutres qui font plusieurs tonnes, c'est tout simplement le parement qui était prévu sur les tours, qui étaient des plaques d'aluminium qui étaient collées sur les poutres en acier. Les poutres en acier, elles sont là et là. Ça c'est juste des choses très légères qui ont volé, comme tout à l'heure ma touillette à café. Voilà. Voilà.
Kiran is mistaken. The chunks of material being hurtled hundreds of feet away are not just aluminum covering. They are the same prefabricated blocks of steel structure used to build the two towers. In this case, a person who has remained attached to a block of columns falling can give us an idea of the structural pieces being detached from the building. Several large chunks of structure ended up embedded in buildings nearby. David Chandler of Architects and Engineers has calculated the energy needed to hurtle some of these chunks of structure to such a distance from the buildings.
Using special software, we can analyze motion on video clips frame by frame. I have placed markers on each frame so we can track a particular projectile. From the markers, we can get a data table and plot various graphs. The data here shows that the object we were tracking was shot horizontally at over 70 miles per hour. The energy needed to hurl a 4-ton girder at this speed is comparable to the energy needed to hurl a 200-pound cannonball 3 miles.
Question. Given that the falling upper sections of the towers had no additional energy to destroy the healthy structure below, where did the energy to hurtle these large chunks of structure at such a distance from the towers come from? Once the smoke had settled and the recovery work commenced, more evidence pointing at controlled demolitions started to emerge. One example are the supporting columns cut at a 45-degree angle that were noticed sticking out of the ground. This kind of cut is typical of controlled demolitions and is obtained by placing linear charges on the columns at a 45-degree angle.
Now this is a linear shaped charge and it's wired in with the dynamite. When it cuts, it'll cut this column right on this angle, and then this piece will be deflected and displaced in that direction.
Some of those cuts on the larger chunks of the structure, called candlesticks, were made by iron workers during the removal operations. But cut columns were noticed on the very evening of September 11, far before the removal operations had started.
You know, this is the first day in a pile. You know, actually, it was on the 11th. It was 8 o'clock at night, and we had a hunt for iron workers. But meanwhile, there was tons and tons of beams that were cut, with no acetylene to be had, nor iron workers to do the work. It's just physically not possible to cut that much steel in that amount of time, especially with no one to operate the equipment. It just didn't add up.
When asked about the presence of columns cut at a 45-degree angle, Danilo Coppe, Italy's foremost expert in controlled demolitions, stated, "I'll confess, this is extremely curious from a technical point of view, as this is a very similar result to the one obtained with cutting charges." Another kind of cut commonly used in controlled demolitions is the so-called V-cut.
This little V here gives it a place to slide off. That's all it does. And by putting them on at this diagonal, we're trying to fill this structure in this direction.
A large V-cut is visible on this chunk of structure from Building 7. The same chunk exhibits also a 45-degree angle diagonal cut on the crossbeam, with a lighter V-cut at the end of the other beam. Can you suggest a good reason why iron workers would need to perform V-cuts and a 45-degree cut on this piece of structure just to remove it from the rubble? Another element suggesting the use of explosives is the complete disappearance of the hat trusses, the large steel structures that connected and bound the towers from above. The hat trusses covered an area of 1 acre in size and sat on the very top of each building. There was nothing above that could have crushed them except for the antenna on the North Tower, which in fact was supported by the hat truss. If a simple gravitational collapse had occurred, one would expect to find the hat trusses sitting on top of the rubble, partially deformed maybe, but still recognizable. Instead, both steel structures, each 1 acre in size, seemed to have vanished into thin air. From the hundreds of pictures taken at Ground Zero, including the aerial shots, no recognizable section of the hat trusses seems to be visible. Curiously, the antenna from the North Tower was found, deformed but still recognizable. But the hat trusses which bound the towers together and supported the antenna seemed to have vanished completely. Possibly the most important unexplained phenomenon at Ground Zero are the extremely high temperatures registered under the rubble for many weeks after the collapses. On September 16, NASA shot these thermographic images of Ground Zero, indicating unusually high temperatures at the base of the 3 collapsed buildings. Despite the heavy rains of September 14th, the hotspots registered peak temperatures of more than 1,300 degrees under the rubble. 10 days later, the fires kept burning.
What's to explain, Governor, the smoke that still comes out?
There's still fire down below. There is such an incredibly deep pile of rubble, and the tower goes down 5-6 stories underground.
But we had ABC crews come back just in the last few minutes and telling us there are still flames coming out of the base of the trade towers.
For the rescue workers, this became an additional burden on their already gruesome task.
Out still on the rubble, it's still, I believe, 1,100 degrees. The guy's boots just melt within a few hours.
On October 8th, the hotspots under the 3 collapsed buildings remained clearly visible. 6 weeks later, as the excavations progressed, the situation seemed only to get worse.
Oh, it's unbelievable. And this is 6 weeks later, almost 6 weeks later. And as we get closer to the center of this, it gets hotter and hotter. It's probably 1,500 degrees. We've had some small windows into what we thought was the core at some point, and it looked like an oven. You know, it was just roaring inside. And it's just a bright reddish-orange color.
The consequences of such extreme temperatures were quite visible on the steel that was being extracted from the rubble.
Where the grapplers were pulling stuff out, big sections of iron that were literally on fire on the other end. They would hit the air and burst into flames, which was pretty spooky to see.
You would create an air pocket by moving steel, fueling the fires underground. But, you know, these underground fires were just like the fires of hell.
If you could make a video of what you perceive hell to look like, from fire shooting up at times, that's what would happen. You would be in the middle of what would look like steel, and then fire just would pop up. Firemen were coming out with, and ironworkers with their boots literally melted. And then the hose would come over and they would try to put that part out.
I got there.
Charlie Vichers was a supervisor of removal operations at Ground Zero. From PBS's America Rebuilds page, we read, Vichers' crew picked up 40 to 60-foot long pieces of steel impaled in the pile, where the bottom 20 feet would be glowing red hot. Vichers said, trucks loaded with steel would pass by and you could feel the back of your neck burning standing 20 feet away. In an article called A Dangerous Worksite, the U.S. Department of Labor wrote, underground fires burned at temperatures of 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. This was confirmed by Mayor Giuliani.
There were fires of 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit below the ground.
The Journal of the American Society of Safety Engineers wrote, thermal measurements taken by helicopter each day showed underground temperatures ranging from 400 to more than 2,800 degrees Fahrenheit. 8 weeks later, and the fires still had not subsided.
You see how this debris is still smoking? That's from the fires that are still burning. 8 weeks later, we still got fires burning. So, I mean, these things are burning. At one point, I think they were about 2,800 degrees.
11 weeks later, and the fires kept burning.
As recently as the end of November, it was still 1,100 degrees down underneath the rubble.
As November turned into December, ice was noticed in the mornings above the ground, but the debris underneath was still smoldering.
The weird thing was it was very cold when we were up there. I believe it was in the middle of the winter, but the ground wasn't frozen. The ground kind of like bubbled underneath your feet, which was kind of strange to me.
It took until December 19, more than 3 months after the collapses, for the last underground fire to be extinguished. The debunkers have suggested different possibilities for this unexplained phenomenon.
Per esempio, può essere il fatto che all'interno sotto c'erano i piani interrati, all'interno c'è un parcheggio con le automobili. Nei piani interrati ci sono i generatori delle torri gemelle. Quindi ci sono molti materiali combustibili.
Neither of these, however, seems to be a valid answer. In regards to the gasoline, the American Society of Safety Engineers wrote, 3 underground floors had been used as a parking garage with a total capacity of 2,000 cars. The cars were eventually located and removed. Some had exploded and were completely burned out, while others were in pristine drivable condition. The gasoline in a car either explodes or it remains inside the tank. It does not leak out and go looking for fires to be fueled. In regards to the generator tank, the Society of Safety Engineers wrote, 72,000 gallons of diesel fuel were stored in a tank on basement level 7. The tank was eventually located and inspected. Although slightly damaged, no leaks were found. The fuel was removed. Another proof of extremely high temperatures reached during the collapses are the twisted and mangled steel beams found at Ground Zero.
Architects, engineers, people who work with steel, welders have just never seen the level of destruction and the level of deformation of this material in our lives.
You saw steel, some of the thickest steel I've ever seen, bent like a pretzel.
This 8-ton steel I-beam is 6 inches thick. It was selected to be preserved for future generations for the near-perfect horseshoe-like bend formed during the collapse.
I found it hard to believe that it actually bent because of the size of it and how there's no cracks in the iron. It bent without almost a single crack in it. It takes thousands of degrees to bend steel like this.
In fact, the temperature of 2,800 degrees mentioned before is not casual at all, as that's exactly the temperature at which steel melts. And molten steel was repeatedly found under the rubble at Ground Zero.
Get down below and you'd see molten steel running down the channel rails. Like you're in a foundry.
Yeah, like lava.
Like lava.
From a volcano.